What does a young man who's part of an ancient religious order have to teach us about philosophy, happiness, and the good life? Find out next.
Hey everyone, thanks so very much for joining us on another episode of The Catholic Gentleman. We are your co-hosts, Sam Guzman and John Heinen. We are excited to be joined here today by a man who needs no introduction for many people, and that's Father Gregory Pine. But before we get to him and our introduction of him, I want to thank you and ask you to make sure to like and subscribe if this is your first time listening, second time listening, 50th time listening. We appreciate it. And that all helps the algorithm, helps reach more men like you. If you are so inclined, we have an awesome store with a bunch of custom Catholic Gentleman goods. We also have a Patreon account, patreon.com/Catholic Gentleman, which will help support the ministry. All the proceeds go to allow Sam and I to continue doing these things, to reach more men, and for a lot of future endeavors that we have and in mind to work towards. So check those out. And again, thanks so much. Again, today we have Father Gregory Pine. He is a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph. He is presently assigned on a doctoral candidate in dogmatic theology at the University of Fribourg. Fribourg? How do you say that?
What do you say, Fribourg?
Fribourg. There we go. It's not German. In Switzerland. He served previously as the assistant director for campus outreach at the Thomistic Institute. He is the co-author of Marian Consecration with Aquinas and Credo, an RCIA program, and the author of a new book, Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. I'm going to put all that in the show notes. He is also a regular contributor to the podcasts Pints with Aquinas and Godsplaining, both which Sam and I are very familiar with, Sam being on Pints, both of us being on Godsplaining. So Father Gregory Pine, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Delighted to be.
Awesome. So as Sam was suggesting there at the beginning, why did you choose to become a Dominican? Of all the orders that are out there, what brought you to the life as a Dominican?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that is not immediately apparent, or that's not patently obvious, I suppose, because it's a little bit of a strange choice. Growing up, I didn't have really any real aspirations to be a priest or to be a religious. I think that whenever I was captivated by a potential vocation or profession, I just added it to a list. So I think at one point, my list did include the priesthood, but it was to be a robot making, basketball playing paleontological priest. So Excellent. It was more of a side hustle. I was serious about finding dinosaur bones, but if I could also celebrate the sacraments, kind of here and there, I would have been pleased. But then in high school, I applied and got into Franciscan University of Steubenville, and my sisters had gone there before me. And when I went, they were like, for your first year, don't date. So that way you make good friends, make a wide variety of friends rather than spending a lot of your time with just one, presumably wonderful young woman. And I was like, that seems like good sense. So I didn't. And that year I also went to a lecture by a professor from St. Louis University named Eleanor Stump. And she lectured on Aquinas on the nature of love. Before then, I had read pious books. I had read spiritual books. I had read even some philosophical and theological books, not many, but I had vague and eclectic notions about what the church taught. So if you're Greg, give a talk about the Blessed Virgin Mary, I could be there's this guy named St. Louis de Montfort, and he said this stuff. And also I read the Gospel of Luke once, and I found this thing over here. And I also went to a church once in Lourdes when I was 8, and that was cool. So it's kind of like a come at you from all over type place experience. And then the way that she explained St. Thomas on the nature of love, it was synthetic, and it was very clear that she saw reality through the eyes of St. Thomas, as it were, as something whole and then basically as something that you could gain access to and then explain as it was. So it wasn't like she had memorized a bunch of propositions and was rattling them off. It was almost as if she saw reality by having studied St. Thomas Aquinas, and she had a grammar and like a vocabulary basically for describing it in a way that corresponded with my experience of life. So I was like, that's what I've always wanted to say, or that's what I've always wanted to know, but I've never been able to. And I feel like this is an invitation. And so I picked up a book about St. Thomas Aquinas, which is actually like a little life of St. Thomas Aquinas, historical fiction. And by the end of that book, I was like, I want to love the Lord. I want to serve the Lord the way in which St. Thomas Aquinas did. So I'll just do exactly what he did, but in a different country and in a different century. And yeah, that was basically the trajectory.
So when you were discerning, did you discern other religious orders, or was really just that connection to Thomas Aquinas, and that was it for you? Like diocesan priesthood, see you later, Franciscan? I don't think so. Even though they had Bonaventure and others, it was just Thomas Aquinas all the way.
Yeah, it was just St. Thomas Aquinas all the way. I went to Franciscan University of Steubenville. People often ask, like, you went to a Franciscan school, you became a Dominican. Do you see any conflict? And I am like, no, not in the least. The friars of Franciscan were super encouraging of vocation in general, and they weren't territorial, which is very refreshing. And we went to a CC my sophomore year. So I was, like a lot of students at Franciscan go to the study abroad program in Austria, and then you have the opportunity to travel. And so we went to a CC as a group, and I went to the Basilica of St. Francis, and there's a famous image there of Francis and Dominic embracing. They are said to have met at the Fourth Lateran Council. Mm-hmm. And I bought a little postcard of that, and I put it on my dashboard. I covered the revolutions per minute for a while there. I hope that's not illegal. And that was like the kind of the image that I had in my mind as to why it made sense. St. Francis introduced me to St. Dominic by way of St. Thomas Aquinas. And then I subsequently read G.K. Chesterton's The Dumb Ox. And the first chapter there is actually about St. Francis and St. Thomas Aquinas. And a lot of that resonated. But no, I never really thought about anything else at any great length. I visited the CFRs for a weekend because my friend was going, and I fell asleep every morning in prayer, sitting next to the vocation director, Father Gabriel Bakar, who is a great guy. And I was like, yeah, I stink at this life in very evident fashion, and I'm not attracted to it. So back to plan A.
That's a fantastic way of discernment. If you fall asleep, that's probably not the religious order for you. No, so I'm wondering what's it been like? I mean, you've been Dominican for a while, and for those of us, in the so-called secular world, family life, and just kind of the busyness that comes with that and stuff, like it's kind of hard for us to conceive, like, what's it like being religious? Like, what do you do all day? I mean, you just sit there praying all day, or do you study all day, or what do you do?
While praying.
So what's it been like for you, and what's your day-to-day look like, and what's it been like for you being a religious for the past so many years?
Yeah, that's a good question. Usually when people tell vocation stories or give witness talks more generally, they'll describe some lead up to a profound moment of conversion. Yeah. And that lead up usually describes their life in terms of either sin or sadness, despair, anxiety, addiction, whatever it might be. Right. And they give you, just enough details for you to appreciate how bad it was, so that then when they describe God's interposing of grace, then you see how very stark their kind of 180 was, in a way that highlights, the grace of God. Okay. My experience is that is the exception to the rule. My experience is that the ordinary course in which the Lord works in human hearts is slowly. And that's fine. Okay. So just because you haven't had a wild conversion experience doesn't mean that you're a second-class citizen. And so when I tell my quote unquote vocation story, I typically say, before I entered the Dominicans, I was sad, lonely, and anxious. And then I entered the Dominicans, and then I was sad, lonely, and anxious. So life is difficult before, during, and after. I think one of the things that's beautiful about, vocation of whatever sort, the concrete particular vocation to which you're called, is that it kind of frames the difficulties of life for you in such a way as to make them more intelligible. right?
Mhm.
So rather than like previously, you might think like, this is hard, let me do something else, or this is hard, would that it weren't, or this is hard, I can't even formulate a coherent thought because I'm so oppressed by the present reality. Whereas in the context of a vocation, it just like kind of doesn't matter in a certain sense. It's like, okay, it's hard, or okay, it could be otherwise, or okay, whatever, describe it as you might. But it's like you're committed to this, right? This is your life. Real life is not elsewhere. Real life is it's just here.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, my real life as a Dominican, it takes a different shape depending upon the assignment. So I was assigned in Louisville, Kentucky for a year where I worked in the parish, and then I taught at Bellarmine University. That had one shape. And then I worked for the Thomistic Institute for 2 years. That had its own shape. Presently, I'm a graduate student. So I wake up at like 5:45. I get ready for the day. I pray a holy hour. I say morning prayer and then have mass with my community. And then I'm usually at my desk at 7:40 a.m. And then I have 4 hours and 45 minutes to work. And then midday prayer, followed by midday meal, followed by recreation, where you just like have a little bit of coffee and chat. And then I get back to my desk usually by 1:45, and then I have 5 hours to work. And then at 6:45, rosary, office of readings, vespers, and then dinner. And then I usually get back to my desk about 8 p.m. And I usually have 2 meetings in the evening of whatever sort, like spiritual direction, record a podcast. What else do I do? Like live streams, or just like some person emails the Godsplaining account and says, I have a question about yada, yada, and thus and such. Can you chat it through? It's like, yep, let's do it. So that's like Monday through Friday is typically how it looks. And then I do a lot of like side hustle, I would say, on weekends. So just find opportunities to preach little retreats, days of recollection, take masses here, there, elsewhere in Switzerland. A lot of times I'll go hiking on Saturdays, which is good. That's kind of like a day out where I will listen to an audiobook, which is great. And then, each day has its own particular shape. So there's a kind of asceticism in Dominican life where you replace manual labor with study. And there's a sense that study, and prayer, as it were, are like the principal means whereby you live your contemplative life. So study isn't for the accumulation of information. Study is for the purpose of entering into the mysteries so that you can be conformed to the mysteries. So there's a sense when I sit in front of my computer, it's not just techne, right? It's theoria. It's not just like chugga, chugga, chugga. It's like here are things which are true, and by being conformed to them, I am saved. That doesn't always look the sexiest. A lot of times it's like, wow, I just read this 350-page book in another language, and none of it was helpful for my thesis. What a great blessing. So you have to live in faith, in hope, in charity. Otherwise, it's just like you stare at the void smiles back, and then you're like, great. I'm so glad about everything that just happened.
Though, there's so many parallels with married life. Like, I mean, a lot of people like picture this endless honeymoon of just, joy and bliss and like romance and intimacy and all this stuff. But it's hard. Married life is hard. Family life is hard. Like, there's also those moments where it's like, if there isn't this like final causality that you're like, we're getting to heaven together, like there is that, like, it can wear you down and you can get tired and you can lose your joy. And like, there has to be this continual renewal that takes place where you're kind of continually, receiving that new wine, so to speak, that inwardly gives joy to your day-to-day struggles. Because, truth be told, last night I didn't get much sleep because our baby is waking up an awful lot, teething and things like that. And it can be tiring and things like that. Or someone's having an emotional moment, melting down, screaming. It's like, all right, let's deal with this. And it can be that same feeling of like, this is either completely meaningless or it's supremely meaningful. But the vocation is what gives that context of meaning that helps you press on in those day-to-day struggles. But I thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. And it gives me a little insight into what religious life is like.
Yeah. And I mean, as Sam was saying, there was a lot of different things that you brought up. And one of the things that I really appreciated was your comment about that your discernment was, over time. I always think in my life, be it my systematic, logical nature, my skeptical nature, whatever the case might be, that God really reveals himself in the process, right? It's not any lightning bolt moments. And to hear that from you is, is in such eloquence is a great reminder that, in the walk that we're all in our lives, he's still revealing himself to us. And we just have to, be constantly and consistently going back and looking at that font and discerning what's next. Now, as a Dominican, how do you live out your charism, with preaching and just fathers, as you're aware, when I lived in Connecticut for 2 years doing my master's degree, I was blessed to be able to go to, St. Mary's there, and Father Essenza was a bit of a spiritual director to me, and Father Huginson Dyer became a friend, and they were just the Dominicans there. I started going to daily mass because at the pulpit, you guys were giving me every single thing that I wanted, from the Council of Trent to Catechism of the Catholic Church. It was just such a beautiful thing. And it was very enriching and enlivening for me. And so how do you personally you mentioned that your life has taken many different shapes, but the Dominican charism is definitely different than the Franciscan Cistercian, so how are you able to live that out?
Yeah. So there are 3 go-to mottos of the Dominican order. The first is Laudare, Benedicere, Predicare, which is taken from one of the prefaces of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It would have been the only preface of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the Old Rite. Which just means to praise, to bless, to preach. So this idea that the life of preaching issues from praise, blessing, which is to say from the liturgical life. So the Dominican life is a contemplative life, right? It's a monastic life, and there's a form to it. And so it's not something that you invent. It's not something that you make for yourself or create for yourself. It's a form of life that you assume, or a form of life that you adopt. And so there's this basic or kind of fundamental disposition of docility. All right. And when that is the case, you kind of, how exactly would you describe it? Well, I think like the posture is one of receptivity or patience, with a kind of expectation that there are divine things which are being mediated through the sacred liturgy. Those divine things are addressed to me. Those divine things will sanctify me. So sanctity isn't a project, right, of my own making. Sanctity is a work of God to which I consent, with which I cooperate in some way, shape, or form. So that's the first. There's a real huge emphasis on grace and our entry into the life of grace through worship, specifically liturgical worship. There's one Dominican, 20th century, who writes that the religious by his vowed life seeks to make of his existence a holy and perpetual liturgy. Does it always look like a holy and perpetual liturgy? No. I mean, for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
The next is veritas, right? So truth. I think the Dominican life is fueled by this desire to have your mind conform to reality, because only the truth bears grace, right? There's no grace to be had in proposing a lie, right? Even if you think that lie is more palatable or more tolerable for the other person across from you, it will never bear grace for that person. It will never help that person to confront their difficulties or to confront the reality of their own lives. So the Dominican lives a life of contemplative prayer and study for the purpose of, knowing God and all things in light of God, because that's sanctifying. You don't have to do anything but the truth. Speculative things are worthy of themselves. Because that's the reason for which we were given minds, right? Minds are for knowing, and they're patterned on God's interior life, so that when we know, right, we are more like unto God. And when we know God by God's own knowledge of himself, that's the height of it. And then third and finally is contemplare et contemplata aliis tradere, which means to contemplate and then to give to others things contemplated, or even God contemplated. And here, I think this to me is the difference of Dominican preaching. You're not just proposing interesting things. Okay. It's not a lecture. It's not a conference. It's not like Father did some Lectio Divina. He mined some cool gems from the sacred scriptures, and now he's tossing them before us as if pearls before swine. Nope. That's not it. Like the point of confronting revelation is not to find out interesting things. The point of confronting revelation is to meet God, to get God, in fact. It's like a really powerful image from Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory, where he says, the whiskey priest says, I put God on people's tongue. And I think that the Dominican preacher is convinced that he can actually mediate that encounter. So the Dominican seeks to give God, right? basically to be a vessel or to be a conduit or to be an instrument of ongoing revelation. Because when you proclaim the gospel, you're not just reading an old dead book, right? It's the word, and Christ is present in the word proclaimed, which is in part where I don't like it when people like are all looking at hand missiles during the proclamation of the gospel. I'm like, Jesus is addressing you. I mean, if you need to follow along to pay attention, cool, especially if you have 3 kids who are tugging on your pants, and you just broke a hole through your belt loop and you're like, these things aren't going to stay on. So yeah, the Dominican is fired by that conviction that God is communicable, right? And one can be made such that he is an instrument of the communicating of God. So that's,
Amen.
Yeah, that's it.
No, that's very helpful. Yeah, I appreciate that. And so basically your lived experience throughout the day, each day is one of those 3 or all of them, and preparing yourself for these sort of mysteries and charisms and lifestyle, which I think is beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, it's my lived experience is oftentimes less exalted, right?
Yeah.
But like I have the recognition that something like this is unfolding, once in a while. I call those moments the damn it feels good to be a Dominican moments. When you just kind of you repose in the glory of the charism. You're like, sweet Christmas. Christ was born for this. Let's go. It's like when you and your wife wake up on Christmas morning before your kids and you're well rested. You're like, how did this happen, Jesus? How have you blessed me so abundantly? So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, what you're saying just sounds to me kind of like the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Like there's this propositional knowledge where you can just kind of cram your head with facts, but it's like when that's integrated at the level of your soul, like it actually becomes part of you. Like you become one with truth, so to speak. You're really becoming one with God in Christ. Christ is the logos, the truth, the underlying pattern of reality. And if we conform our minds to that, we're essentially becoming one with it. We commune with what we contemplate. And so I really love that way of thinking about it. I think we've really gotten away from that in the modern way of understanding philosophy and even theology, where it's so propositional and conceptual, but it never becomes one with us at the level of the soul. So I really love your way of describing that. And I think if we started approaching philosophy and theology in that way again, we would see a complete renaissance or renewal in just modern thinking, modern way of thinking. So I guess I want to turn to Aquinas, though. You mentioned so much of his influence on you and how you really kind of just fell in love with his way of seeing the world. And for a lot of people, that might be kind of surprising because you crack open the Summa, if you're brave enough to do that. And it's just this really kind of boring format of questions and answers, and I answer that. And it just goes on and on and on, thousands of pages. And it's how could a young guy exploring the world be excited by this? And yet there was something there that captured your imagination and captured your heart, and you're like, yes, I was looking for this. And just tell us a little bit about Aquinas and your relationship to him.
Yeah, so my first encounter with St. Thomas was that lecture, and the professor who gave it did a great job of translating St. Thomas. I think that St. Thomas is eminently translatable. Here, I'm not just speaking of translation in the literal sense of taking words in one language and making them to be words in another language, but in the sense that St. Thomas expresses himself in an idiom that's proper to his time. And what you find is some people speak in an idiom that's very much limited to their time. But St. Thomas has a way of describing reality and appealing to his reader or to his auditor that I think makes him more readily translatable. For one, St. Thomas's Latin is about the easiest Latin that you can find. Patristic Latin, early medieval Latin, is all far more complex. And then late medieval Latin, getting on towards, the early modern period, it gets complex again. And I tend to think that St. Thomas made his prose purposefully clear, so that way it would be readable. Whereas you read somebody like Hegel and it's like, it seems that this man is trying to confuse me, like that esotericism is part and parcel of his very project, which is devastating because that might inspire inquiry, but it inspires unintelligible inquiry. Because you think about the way in which the Lord preached, in the Gospel of John, whenever he poses something that's a little bit mysterious, he elicits a question, from his disciples, how are we supposed to follow you? We don't know the way. And then our Lord subsequently responds with a clarification that opens the mystery up, right? So I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I think that St. Thomas's preaching is patterned after that of our Lord. So like he provokes questions and then he elicits a response from you. And then he takes you by the hand in a kind of pedagogical way, in a kind of what he calls a monoduxio, a leading by the hand. And then he shows you, right? Such that your mind can make the steps and that the realities proposed take up residence within. And so I think that in terms of his idiom, in terms of the way in which he teaches, he is eminently translatable. And I just think that it's not by happenstance that he's right. I think that what he proposes fits within an ecclesial vision. It fits within a theological vision. It fits within a religious vision, which is just the ripest fruit of like all of Christendom. Do I think that St. Thomas Aquinas can't be surpassed? I don't think that. Do I think that St. Thomas Aquinas has been surpassed when it comes to philosophy and theology within the church's tradition? I just don't, right? I just don't.
Yeah.
I just think he is wise. When you look at the life of the church, it seems that some saints have particular gifts, have particular virtues, have particular graces that distinguish them among their contemporaries and among all those, in the church's life for a particular purpose, right? And I think that St. Thomas was just blessed with a surpassing understanding, knowledge, and wisdom. And I think that you just see that in spades. And for me, it was commended to me basically by his sanctity. The book that I read about him, the first book that I read about him was, like I said, it was a story of his life. And there's just these little small gems that just drew me. There's this story recounted in that book where St. Thomas Aquinas is chatting with one of his sisters and she says, "Thomas, how do I become a saint?" And he says, "Desire it." It's just like, man, I don't know. Just simple things like that just kill me. Does that mean, okay, desire? Does that mean like try harder? No. But it means that amor meo pandus meus, like that love is a kind of gravitation. Like we won't become saints to the degree or to the extent that we formulate, like bizarro world rules. We will become saints to the extent that love conducts us hence, and we can make disciplined decisions in order to, safeguard that love, in order to grow that love. But at the end of the day, it's about love, and that's a fundamental insight that St. Thomas got. So yes, I love him.
Awesome. Yeah. Wow.
So cool. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of great things that you mentioned, and the reality proposed takes up residence within. Was that something that you've written about previously, or did that just come off your tongue in that moment?
It might have just come off I never know actually what I have said until I've said it. I think Chris Rock said that about himself, but I would like to say that it applies to me in a different way.
Agreed. That's too fun. I appreciate you sharing that. I know our listeners are going to love hearing that as well, right? Because Thomas Aquinas becomes divisive in our modern times, unfortunately. People who see him as the only authority, on theology and that within the church, and those who see him as one of many, or actually those that are looking to try and recreate, a new sort of wisdom of the ages that we live in now, which, all seem a little futile, but I appreciate you mentioning that. So I actually wanted to talk to you again, going back to this preaching and the fact that you're on 2 podcasts regularly. You're on this podcast right now. What do you feel like for evangelization that the generation today is looking for, or is most compelling, or what do you feel like we should be moving towards to bring in more people into the authentic and true, fold of the church, but obviously within that relationship and that love of Christ? What are you finding as that which is successful, or that which is providing that gateway towards people today, living in the noise of the digital space, et cetera?
Yeah. I have, well, I'll just give one thought. So I think that something, I don't know that I was wholly convinced in the early 2000s that the new evangelization was new necessarily. But I think that something that is new, something that is afoot, is that there is a greater importance or a greater emphasis placed on the role of the protagonist, right? So it's always been the case that Christ is the protagonist of the Christian life, right? So it's Christ who begs for the heart of man and man who begs for the heart of Christ, says Luigi Giussani. But we partake of that, like we partake of that dynamic. So we become agents, right? We become instruments, we become secondary causes, however you want to describe it, in the dispensation of salvation. And I think that that's something about the American church, which I've grown to love more at a distance. There's a sense in the American church that if something good is to happen, right, then you do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't look to someone else to provide for a need which you have acknowledged, right, which you've addressed, and you're competent to begin to supply for. And I think that that's awesome. There's like a real cool sense of agency, because sometimes agency is inspired by a kind of despair. It's like, okay, God isn't going to do anything about this unless I do. So I have to do it. It's like, no. The type of agency that I think you're seeing in the last 15 years is an agency inspired by hope. It's a sense that like, okay, God is doing things, and God is doing things in and through me. All right. And the things that I do may not last forever. You know, a lot of people start podcasts and then take a step back from podcasts. I imagine the average life of a podcast is probably like 5 episodes. That's a made up statistic, but it's something that seems right. But I think that in the life of the church, everything will fail, right? Everything will fail, save the universal church. You think about the church in Northern Africa, okay, during the 7th century. If you were to make a map of it in like 630, for instance, lots of dioceses, made up number, maybe 500 dioceses. All right, you look at that same map in the 8th, 9th century, they're all gone, okay, because Islam swept through. So that's a bracing reality. Local churches can and do fail. Lots of things can and do fail, but that need not be an occasion for discouragement. I remember my first summer assignment. I was assigned to St. Pius V Parish in Providence, Rhode Island. And I was like trying to do programs for people of different age groups in the parish. And one of the things that I wanted to do for like younger people was I did scripture and sports. So it was going to be like an open gym night, but would start with a little Bible study. The first time that I had it, one kid came and I was like, we're not going to do this. So, you know, here's a chaperone. We're just going to walk you back to your house. All the best. And then I just rebranded it the next week as just open gym with no scripture, you know? So it's just like, and we had a great time. And who knows if that made any impact on those children's lives? I imagine almost none, but that's okay. Okay. Because I think there's a sense that like we try to think it failed. Who cares? It's not a negative reflection on you that you did a bad thing or you're a bad person. It's just you throw spaghetti at the wall and sometimes it sticks, or maybe it's the ceiling. I don't know. I'm not Italian enough. So I think that something that's characteristic about this present generation is a real sense of hope, which inspires a real sense of agency, with this conviction that we are the protagonists of the Christian life, not because we cannot rely upon God to be such, but because we can, right? Precisely because we can. And that's awesome. And I'm starting to see that in like a little bit here and there in Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Germany, places where I visited recently. But it's something that's very pronounced in the American church, something for which I'm very, very grateful.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. Yeah. I appreciate that. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do in various different forms, you know, in media and means. And you're right. You know, I think, 5 or 7 podcasts, but consistency, right, is what I'm hearing, right? That consistent attempt. And if it doesn't work the first time, right, you know, we continue to grow in that understanding, but we don't stop in our forward movement to Christ and to bringing ourselves and others to him. So,
yeah. Amen.
Yeah. And I just kind of want to follow up on what you just said too, which I think was really, really wonderful. But I'd love your thoughts on kind of a polarization that I see happening right now. And it's been happening, but it's getting worse between, you know, the traditionalists and the so-called progressives, where the traditionalists say, if we could just go back to like, I don't know, pick your time frame, 1920s Catholicism, 1890s Catholicism, whatever. If we could just like flip the switch back, revert the liturgy back, revert all the traditions back, then all of the problems would take care of themselves, in essence. And then the progressives say essentially the exact opposite. Like if we could just like abolish tradition, if we could just dismiss it, jettison it, like rewrite Catholic history, like everything would be so much better. Like the church would just be whole and healthy, and like we would get rid of these cranky traditionalists, and it would be one big happy family. Of course, we know both positions probably aren't realistic, but you're in an interesting position because you're part of an ancient order that goes back, 800 years. You're steeped in the Western intellectual tradition, kind of from beginning to end. And so I'd love your perspective on this kind of dichotomy or dialectic that's happening in the church, and what's the way forward for the church? You mentioned this virtue of hope that I really love, but like where's the future as far as you see it? Like where are things tending, and how can we move forward in our own way in our own lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually just recorded an episode of Godsplaining with Father Bonaventure on the theme, and it released on whatever that would be, Thursday, February 3rd. It's called Politicizing All of Life. So that's like a 30-minute response to this question. I guess, so I have a few basic convictions. One is there are no golden ages. And not in the sense like historical facticity that there aren't times which are better than other times. I think there probably are times that are better than other times, but I think it's very difficult to verify that claim, right? For a variety of reasons, kind of like epistemologically, criteriologically, historically. It's just hard, because you're like, oh, whatever was the greatest time. And it's like, yeah, but like, I don't know, 45% of people living in this picture that you've showed to me have like teeth rotting out of their heads, So, I mean, what do we mean by better? Like, what are we describing as better? And I don't mean to be like crassly materialistic about it, because I think that there are good metrics, but those metrics are often unverifiable. Like, what does it mean to take someone's spiritual temperature from 800 years afterwards? I just don't know what that means. The 20th century produced the most saints. Is that part of the canonization process, or is that just like a kind of accident, as it were, of the way in which we promote to the altars in the present day? I mean, is that just world population? I mean, there are so many factors for which you need to adjust. And because it's so difficult, right, I just don't think that golden age thinking actually helps us in 2022. Because my experience is that it typically produces a response of one of two sorts, which you described. We begin to idealize it and like long for those flesh pots, or we just reject it wholesale. And that causes some serious problems. So I think that just by disposition and by kind of like ecclesial affiliation, I'm very sensitive to the kind of traditionalist camp. So may as well show cards rather than be, innocent as a dove and, crafty as a serpent. And I really feel for traditionalists at this moment, because I feel like they're getting beaten up, and I feel like they're getting beaten up for reasons that just defy my comprehension, which is sad. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, in order to like be a good traditionalist, I think that there is a good instinct there of general conservatism. I think of what Chesterton says: you come to a fence in the woods, all right, before you tear it down, you should probably, try to verify either what it's keeping in or what it's keeping out. So I think it's just good to have conservative instincts about monuments of the past, whether those be institutional or liturgical or whatever, right? We need to weigh them in the context of a communal conversation, because that's what politics used to be about, and it's no longer. So we need to find fora for discovering that. On the negative side, though, I think that we want to avoid the preferential option for the old, the preferential option for the ancient, because some old things were bad, right? They just weren't good. We lament the fact that many churches were whitewashed in the 1960s and 70s, and I think we lament it for good reason. But not all of the art which was painted over was good art. Some of it was really tacky, because I've seen some of those walls stripped down and seen the art revealed, and it's just like, woof, yeah. So I think that we want to be careful just from exercising the preferential option for the ancient. And I think it's really important that there be beautiful things, that there be excellent things made in 2022. And I think of St. John Paul II's letter to artists, right? There is a reason for which we were born here and now. This age is perfect for us because it's ours, right? So we're not optimists. We're not pessimists. We're effectively cosmic patriots in the kind of Chestertonian flag of the world sense. Like, this is ours, and so we love it as such. And in loving it, you beautify it. In loving it, you redeem it as a kind of extension of Christ's humanity. So that's on the one side. On the other side, I think the progressive side, I mean, there are some good insights. Archbishop Chaput is famously quoted as having said, if you don't love the poor, you're going to hell, right? And because of like strange transpositions in the way in which welfare systems have been not overhauled since 1996, right? Like the stigmatization of the poor has become like a pretty acute problem. I'm thinking in the United States, right?
Yeah.
Are there good arguments on both sides? Absolutely, right? But like to the extent that we distance ourselves from the poor, I think we're in trouble, because you just can't read the gospel without being confronted by that fact. It's like, St. John starts preaching and then Jesus starts preaching. What are the first things that they say? It's just like, don't defraud your neighbor. If you've got a cloak or two cloaks, give one away. It's like, it all sounds very quote unquote social justice-y. What I think is a potential threat with social justice type advocacy is that it does despair of divine help and it does despair of divine providence, in the sense that there has to be a thick sense that what we are doing is Christ's work for Christ. Because if it becomes divorced from that, then why? Like, why struggle to build up 2022 apart from the kingdom of God, right? Because all of this is passing away. I spent like 18 hours a week ago troubleshooting my camera because of a variety of problems, the likes of which I still have not sounded. It's like, why would that matter? Just throw trash on the internet. It doesn't matter. But I want to make something beautiful for today because I believe that can actually mediate the word of God. And if 1080p is what YouTube requires in order for the algorithm to promote this to more people who could potentially have their souls saved, then so be it, right? It's worth it in a certain sense. Don't tell my superiors because I'm, supposed to be working full-time on my doctorate and I am working a lot time on my doctorate. But, it's just like, we have to have this cognizance that it's, through him, with him, and in him. And to the extent that we leave that behind, we become something else, right? It's just becomes something else.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And you laid the platform for a perfect conversation about your book, right? Because I think that this is exactly something that Sam and I talk a lot about, is this desire for tradition, which we both have, right? Show your cards. Sam and I are both, madly in love with the Latin Mass and good liturgy. But at the same time, in the digital space, it's often met with a certain degree of hopelessness or a certain degree of antagonistic, mentality towards anybody who's contrary. And it really lacks a certain sense of joy and happiness, within those circles. And I think, as you were kind of saying, to a degree, separated from Christ, separated from that unity with Christ. And so, just kind of shifting a little bit to your book, Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. It's not just about prudence, right? I know that's what you get towards, and I've been able to go through a large amount of that book. But let's go back and let's talk about happiness, and let's talk about how do we maintain our happiness. And in this time when it seems like everything's fallen apart and everybody's beating us up and we're struggling, but still with that same understanding that God knew from the beginning of time, before there was time, that we were chosen to be here now and to help, and to be his witness and to be his instruments, here in the world. So let's talk about happiness. I'd love to hear your conversation about what it is, to what end, and all those great things.
Yeah, I think that it's good to emphasize happiness in Christian conversations insofar as it helps to offset a lot of the language about like duty, law, obligation, sin, conscience, which paints a rather grim picture. It sounds as if God has placed inordinately strict moral demands on his servants, and then he is poised in his heavens waiting until such time as we fail, so that way he can lash out and strike us down. It's like, whoa, but that's a kind of 19th century pious vision that's been propagated in certain quarters. And I think it's just, we just need to be cognizant of the fact that it's present in a lot of people's thinking, and that it may have even infected our own. So when it comes to, like God, we need to be conscious of the fact, or we need to be recollected in the fact that he created us, so that we could partake of his divine life. There's no other way by which to account for it, because he doesn't need us. We supply for no lack in him. And as a result of which we know, right, that his plans for us are good, right? Because those plans issue from his nature, which is good through and through. And then, I suppose on the other side, to kind of make the claim more subtle or nuanced, we don't want to make it sound as if, Christian life is for the pursuit of happiness, as it were, God wishes for you the abundant life, to make it sound as if it's going to be a cakewalk, right? Just hold hands, skip through the fields, laughing all the day. No, I think the kind of happiness, yeah, exactly. The kind of happiness, and God forbid that you show anyone that you're sad, that would be the biggest sin imaginable. So I think that it's more helpful to describe happiness in terms of words which have greater purchase with people in the 21st century. Words like fit, right? I think a lot of people are looking for a fit. All right, I can undergo quite a bit of suffering provided that suffering fits. Like if I'm training for a marathon and I know that I want to run whatever time, like 3:05 in order to qualify for Boston, I'm able to endure a lot of suffering over the course of many weeks because it fits within the plan of my success. And I have a kind of providence, which encompasses all that leads up to the big day. And that providence makes sense, as it were, of the different causal demands placed upon me. And I think that when we're looking for the good life, when we're looking to be happy in this present day and age, we're looking for that kind of participation in God's providence so that we can sympathize with it, so that we can enact it wholeheartedly, like volitionally, deliberately, intentionally, so that we can have a sense like, yes, my life may be sad, lonely, and anxious. Yes, I may be made to endure a variety of terrible, terrible things. But yes, like I know that this issues from the heart of God, that this is ordered to my happiness, that it fits within a plan, which plan is good, which plan redounds to glory and the salvation of souls. And I think that is possible, right? It is possible. And at the very least, we have to affirm that, right? So as to provide others an entree into a richer plan that exceeds the compass of their present imaginings.
Yeah. So that is a fantastic way of putting it. And I agree about the language, that resonates with modern individuals more so. It's kind of like Viktor Frankl said, like the meaning is what really is more important than happiness ultimately. Like if we can find meaning in what we undergo, then happiness will kind of take care of itself. But the other dimension that I want to talk about real quick is Eastern philosophy, which is spreading like, wildfire and has been for, 70 years or more now. It's just kind of taken root in the West. And a lot of people say, well, I get it. I want to be happy, or I want to find meaning in life. So I'm just going to download the Headspace app and I'm just going to like meditate every day. And then I'll just like clear all the mental clutter and I'll just be happy. And yet Christianity has this like distinctly different vision. Like you look at like Buddhism or, they talk about like, emptiness or the void, and there's kind of this search for ultimate reality. Yes. Similar to in the Western tradition, but it's in many cases highly impersonal. It's an experience of void or emptiness or nirvana or and maybe it's very profound, but it's not personal. It's not someone I can love so much as it is just an experience that will maybe give me peace or help me transcend suffering. But in the Christian tradition, it's so very personal. Like ultimate reality is not empty. It's someone you can know. It's a person. It's someone you can love and who loves you. And that's distinctly different. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about like a lot of people today, they're maybe on this quest for meaning or purpose and happiness in life, but they don't see the need for this personal dimension, this need for Christ specifically, for, God as revealed in the Trinity. They say, why can't I just find ultimate reality through meditation or mindfulness or these different practices that maybe give you a level of psychological peace, but aren't ultimately a relationship with reality?
Yeah, no, that's very beautifully said. And just super pertinent, I think, for the present times. It's like we've come to prefer like homeostasis to ecosystematic harmony, as it were. We've just reduced the frame in which we conceive of equilibrium, whereas it used to be more like mystical body being a good image for the Christian vision. It's like you're part of an organic whole, right? And as a result of which, yes, you have your own personal identity. You're not just a drop of water subsumed within the ocean upon your death, but that you relate ad alterum. And I think here of Genesis 2, I was just writing a little bit this morning. I was thinking about transgenderism. And I think that transgenderism begins with a kind of recognition of the need for relationality, but rather than like situating one's dysphoria within the context of church, polity, family, friendship, etc. So receiving from without and then conforming to a sane vision, which is mediated by those who have gone before and those who go with. Instead, one makes a determination interiorly, right? And then admits into the form of the heart, like a variety of other influences, whether that be like pornography or abuse or the type of grooming that you sometimes hear about in these online forums and things like that, where it's at the service of my own self-description. And mind you, that's like an oversimplification that doesn't do justice to individual people's experiences. But it's fascinating that like the search for peace now radiates out and rather than something that radiates from without to within, which is, I mean, it's a huge sea change. And I think that we're only beginning to appreciate how very different it is. It's consonant with the move from speculative to practical reason, rather than being shaped by reality, by taking reality in and having my mind and therefore my, behavior conform to it. Now I just change reality to conform to my own interior states, whether those states be orderly or disorderly. That's not actually a question to be raised. So it's like, yeah, it's wild. It's totally unanchored, and it's very unnerving and unsettling as a result. But then I'm thinking of Genesis 2 and this idea of St. John Paul II's theology of the body, where he describes how man kind of recognizes himself and his need in relation to others who are unalike, right? And that's a reflection of his posture before God in creation, this like idea of original solitude or original nakedness, right? But just to put that in more simple philosophical terms, we're made towards the other, right? So like I said, St. Thomas prefers to describe the image of God not as we are made in imagine Dei. He says often that we are made ad imaginem Dei. Mm-hmm. So it's a static reality which gives rise to a dynamic movement. Like we have minds for knowing, we have hearts for loving, both of which things open us to their object, the knowable, the true, right? The lovable, the good, so that we can be shaped by that, so that we can be matured by that, grown by that, and ultimately saved by that. But then if you begin to pervert and make it about your impressing upon reality, the cast or shape of your own, particular expression of original sin, it's a recipe for disaster. Again, like G.K. Chesterton says, he's in conversation with people in his day and age who would have been very sanguine about the prospects of continual progress because of technological advances. And he says, like cool. But the only intrinsic principle that I see working itself out inexorably is not a principle of evolution. It's a principle of devolution, and it's original sin. So if we let the thing go on its own, it's going to get worse. Right. And I think that, we're just super naive about that. Just terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. And just this like you said, this radical shift in orientation from receiving reality, and maybe even to an extent receiving your identity, as a matter of tradition. Like reality is something that is received rather than invented, which is kind of the definition of tradition. We're inventing everything from scratch, and the external must conform to the internal. So if there's, I think I'm a rabbit, like I have to go out and like change all these laws and like social mores and customs to like conform to my inner reality. And that's a huge, like monumental project that like people are taking on. But it's something that the church has to grapple with in our kind of proclamation of the gospel in these times, is this shift in this orientation where reality kind of flows out from me rather than flowing into me.
Well, thank you for all that, Father. So I want to make sure that we have time to talk about your new book, Prudence, Choose Confident, Live Boldly. I know that one of the things that really was resonating with me as I was going through it was this idea of discernment with your conflicting convictions, right? We're often also busy, and then we can instantly justify our busyness, because maybe it's all for God. Maybe everything we're doing is done with a conversation with God, and we know that it can bring good to other people's lives, and we enjoy doing it. But instead of just one or two jobs, that opens us up to be able to work those efforts more effectively and more in line with his will. We do 10 jobs, and we're kind of broken apart. But again, that was what was resonating with me and really attracting me as we're going through that, is simplifying your life for the sake of happiness. But what do you hope individuals get out of your book, and how can it better their lives? And, what was your intent behind writing it?
Yeah. So basically it's 8 chapters long. The first 3 chapters are kind of setup of Christian life, and it just goes kind of like through happiness and the search for meaning from the first chapter. And then the second just situates you within salvation history, and then the variety of means that God gives to attain to said good life. And then the third chapter is specifically about virtue. And then the remaining 5 chapters are about prudence. And like 4 and 5 are kind of like the St. Thomas under the hood, just talking about what prudence is and what prudence does effectively in the life of virtue. And then for me, the whole point of the book are chapters 6, 7, and 8, which are called respectively, Are You Bold? Are You Certain? And Are You Confident? And
yeah,
I mean, like the point of that section is just to simply say that the way in which we conceive decision-making is often a little off, but in being a little off, it undoes us in a variety of ways. Just to say simply that to be prudent, to grow in prudence, means that you just make the best with what you have. And to live a prudent life will often look like a forward progressing dumpster fire at times, but that's okay, because that's what our nature was designed to unfold, or our nature was designed to unfold according to that law. So I think that sometimes we expect too much of, kind of certainty or clarity. We expect a kind of mathematical certitude, but contingent matters just don't admit of that. Or sometimes it's like we think that knowing is enough. Knowing isn't enough, right? The judgment of conscience says, don't do this thing. But beyond don't do this thing, you need to conjure the moral, genius, as it were, to not do it, right? To actually like persevere in the action. And then when it comes to, just like being confident about decisions, it's like the Lord doesn't expect you to be perfect yesterday, right? The Lord expects you to try to be perfect today. And that's going to entail a lot of error and even a lot of sin. But God makes all things work to the good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose, even sin. So I think that just to kind of frame prudence within that setting and simply say like, be free, be bold, choose, go, you've got this, or the Lord's got this in you. He has plans for your welfare, not for your woe. So, get after it. That's the hope of the book, basically, chapter 6, 7, and 8.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate that. I will say that it's really easy to read, which I appreciate that. Right. And so, anybody who's listened to you on any of your podcasts and stuff like that, I can quickly grapple and understand your intelligence. And that's wonderful. It gives authority to your word. But going through the book, it's incredibly easy to digest. And I would say, something that all of our listeners could benefit from.
Dig. Thanks. Yeah. When like sometimes I'm mining YouTube for questions to answer in subsequent episodes, looking at comments is always a little bit scary, if you're a fragile millennial.
Yeah.
and I'll look at comments and it's like, Joe, bruv, speak a little more plainly. It's like point taken.
I'll let John do
1000%.
That. That's right. I do. I take the beating in our comments, but yeah, well, so to that point, the book is right on track. It's even the higher level theology that you go into and understanding of the human person is brought down, even with your diagrams and everything like that, right? So that it can make sense.
What I like about the book is that so often people have this impression of theology or philosophy that it's just how many angels dance on the head of a pin or whatever, like just so completely irrelevant to my daily life. But like the point of theology is to be lived, and the point of philosophy is to be integrated into us. So like your book really takes it from this kind of heady intellectual space, which you could easily stay there, but then you bring it down to how do we live? Like how do we live well? And live in a way that prepares us for eternal happiness. So I really appreciate that about the book. Is it published? It's published now, right? Like I know we got kind of a sneak preview, but
it's available on Amazon for pre-order, but it'll be shippable on April 18th. So whatever that is.
Okay.
Yep. Soon.
Awesome. Well, I feel extra privileged now that
That's
I
right.
got a sneak preview. So.
Well, we'll be sure to put that link for the pre-order on Amazon in the show notes.
Thanks.
So, Father, any last things that you'd like to share with our guests, about men today, right? Those are our listeners, and what we need to be doing to strive for holiness and to accept that challenge.
Preach at us.
Yeah.
I think that many men are afraid that they've missed out, or that there is something essential lacking to their formation, because you hear many things said of the 21st century and how manhood is become a politicized theme, or because what would ordinarily have passed for manhood is now the object of great scrutiny or criticism and things like that. And so men feel less confident to be men, or men feel scrutinized in being men. But I think that one conviction that I have, and it's just a basic Christian conviction, is Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that being the case, while the circumstances may be more difficult, right? You don't lack anything that is essential for your holiness. By comparison, I've heard a statistic that if a father goes to church willingly with his family, all right, the chances that his children will persevere in the practice of the faith after their college graduation is something like between 85 and 90%. It's just staggeringly high, right? Mm-hmm. Because a father has a capacity to validate the faith. So think, like, what if you're a woman, who marries a man who is in an RCIA class while you're in preparation for the marriage, and then he has a traumatic experience in his life, he falls away from the practice of the faith, and he becomes very contrary to it, and you're taking your kids and you're thinking to yourself, like, chances that these kids persevere in the faith statistically is like 15%. Like, maybe I should, what does that woman say to herself? Maybe I should be the father to them. Maybe I should get a divorce. Maybe I should, what is she, how does she fill in that blank? And the one thing I would say to that woman is, your job is to be their mother, right? And the Lord will give you everything that you need to be their mother, and to be their mother beautifully and well. And I think that you can apply a similar conviction to the lives of husbands and fathers, that, I don't know what your anxieties are. Like, maybe like one of your little kids has, like, one of your little boys has effeminate tendencies, and you're like, it's just in the water in the 21st century. What am I doing wrong as a father? Or like, maybe one of your college age kids is a little bit touch and go with practicing the faith. And you're like, what did I do? How did I fail? What, like, you may be posing to yourself serious questions about your limitations as a man, as a husband, as a father. And I would just say, just return to the font of masculinity, return to the source of your masculine virtue, who is Christ himself. And Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So what he mediated to his disciples in the first century remains available to you in the 21st century. It will look different. It will come by different means, but it is still rich and abundant and enough, more than enough, in fact. I would just say, don't be afraid. Take heart, be of good courage. The Lord has overcome the world, and you have what it takes, to do the mission, or to perform the vocation for which you've been called.
That's beautiful. Yeah. So often we focus on the lack, what we don't have. And I love the reorientation to the fact that we have everything that we need in Christ. Thank you for that.
Boom.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Father? Sorry.
Oh, no, I just said boom, but it actually reminds me. Yeah. So for Godsplaining, we're having a few retreats this summer, and one of them it's like that. Basically, it's called Christ Model of Men. So it's a young man's wilderness retreat. So we have like an all-comers retreat, and then a young adults retreat, both of which are mixed. And then we have just a young men's retreat, which is going to be in the mountains and just outside of Brevard, North Carolina. So check out godsplaining.org if that's something you've been interested in. They're in July and August.
Awesome.
So, party on.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that's something that interests you. Definitely check it out. So, well, I mean, it was a perfect way to end the episode. That just lines up so well with our motto, right, Sam? So, as we like to end each episode.
Be a man, be a saint.